The morning on Avarice 7 started the same way it always did. The twin suns rose over flat golden fields, and the wind carried the smell of alien wheat across the valley. It was a quiet world, a farming world, the kind of place where nothing ever happened, and that was exactly the point. Dr. Lena Vasic knelt in the dirt outside her small research station, her fingers buried in dark soil. She was studying microbes, tiny, invisible things that lived in the ground of this planet, things that no one else in the galaxy cared about. She liked it that way. She liked the silence. She liked the routine. Wake up, collect samples, run tests, eat alone, sleep. A simple life for a simple woman. At least that was what everyone believed. She was 34 years old, average height, lean but not muscular. Her brown hair was tied back in a messy knot. Her clothes were stained with dirt. She wore no jewelry, carried no weapon, and had no military record in any database the galaxy could access. She was, by every measure that mattered to the universe, completely ordinary. The first sign of trouble came just after midday. A shadow fell across the fields, not a cloud, something bigger. Lena looked up and saw the ships cutting through the pale sky like black knives. There were 6 of them, long and angular, with hulls that seemed to drink the light. She recognized the design immediately. Vreth Dominion carriers, slaver ships. She did not run. She stood up slowly, wiped the dirt from her hands, and watched the ships descend. Around her, the colony erupted into chaos. People screamed. Families grabbed their children and ran for the shelters that everyone knew would not hold. The colony had no defense grid, no military garrison, no warships in orbit. Avarice 7 was a frontier settlement of 800 people who grew food and studied soil. It was not supposed to be worth attacking. But the Vreth did not care about worth. They cared about bodies. The landing craft hit the ground hard, throwing up clouds of dust and broken wheat. The ramps dropped and the Vreth poured out. They were tall, nearly 3 meters, with hard black exoskeletons and 4 arms that ended in clawed hands. Their faces were flat and insectoid, with compound eyes that reflected the sunlight like broken mirrors. They moved fast, faster than anything that large should move, and they carried shock lances that crackled with blue energy. The harvest took less than 2 hours. The Vreth were efficient. They had done this many times before. They swept through the colony in organized lines, driving people out of buildings, stunning anyone who resisted, and sorting the captives into groups with the cold precision of factory workers processing grain. The strong went into one shuttle. The young went into another. The old and the sick were left behind. They were not worth the fuel. Lena allowed herself to be herded with the others. She walked with her head down, her shoulders hunched, her face blank. A Vreth soldier scanned her with a handheld device and grunted something in its clicking language. The device translated it into a classification that appeared on a small screen: female, human, academic caste, negligible threat. She was pushed toward the general holding shuttle with the other low-value captives. Inside the shuttle, the air was thick and hot. 200 people were packed into a space meant for cargo. Children cried. A man with a broken arm moaned in the corner. A woman near the door kept saying the same prayer over and over, her lips moving without sound. The fear in that room was so heavy it had a taste, like metal and sweat. Lena sat against the wall and closed her eyes. She did not pray. She did not cry. She breathed slowly, counting each breath, and behind her closed eyelids her mind was working. She counted the guards she had seen. 42 on the ground, organized in teams of 6. She noted the weapons. Shock lances for crowd control, plasma sidearms for the officers, no heavy ordnance visible. She estimated the shuttle capacity and calculated the total number of captives across all shuttles, approximately 217. She filed this number away in her memory like a scientist recording data. The shuttle lifted off. Through a small viewport, she watched Avarice 7 shrink below them, her garden, her research station, her quiet little life falling away. For a moment, something flickered across her face. Not fear, something closer to sadness. Then it was gone and her expression was empty again. The carrier ship swallowed them whole. The shuttle docked in a massive bay filled with the echoing sounds of machinery and Vreth language. The captives were marched out and sorted again, this time more carefully. A Vreth officer with gold markings on its exoskeleton walked down the line, examining each human with the detached interest of a buyer at a livestock auction. When it reached Lena, it paused. Its compound eyes studied her. She stared at the floor. It moved on. She was assigned a number. She was given a thin gray uniform. She was fitted with a pain compliance collar, a metal band around her neck that could deliver an electric shock strong enough to drop a grown man to his knees. She accepted all of this without a word. The holding cell was a long room with metal walls and dim blue lighting. 50 people were crammed inside. There were no beds, no privacy, and no hope. The door sealed shut with a sound like a coffin closing. Lena found a corner and sat down. She looked at the people around her. She looked at the walls. She looked at the ceiling. And very quietly, so quietly that no one heard, she began to tap her finger against the metal floor, feeling the vibrations of the ship around her. She was mapping the vessel through its heartbeat. 10,000 light-years away, on Earth, in a room that existed on no official floor plan, a screen lit up in the darkness. 3 people sat around a table, their faces blue in the monitor's glow. The screen showed a single line of text, blinking steadily. LAZARUS Asset 7 Status, CAPTURED. Location, VRTH Carrier Designation Unknown, Tracking Active. Admiral Reva Cortez read the words twice. She leaned back in her chair and pressed her fingers against her temples. The man to her left, a gray-haired intelligence officer named Strand, looked at her with an expression that was hard to read. "Do we extract?" he asked. Cortez shook her head slowly. "No, we let it play. There are over 200 civilians on that ship." "I know." Cortez looked at the screen again. "And there is one Lena Vasic. The civilians are why we let it play. She will not leave them behind. She never does." Strand was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Should we warn the fleet?" Cortez almost smiled. It was not a happy expression. "Warn them about what? A 5'6" woman who studies dirt." She stood up and walked toward the door. "God help them," she said softly, and it was not clear whether she meant the colonists or the Vreth. The door closed behind her, and the screen kept blinking in the dark. The first day aboard the Vreth carrier was the worst. Not because of the violence, though there was violence. Not because of the hunger, though they were barely fed. It was the worst because of the silence that came after the screaming stopped, when every captive understood the same truth at the same time. No one was coming to save them. The holding cell smelled of sweat, fear, and the sharp chemical odor of the Vreth disinfectant they sprayed through the vents every few hours. The blue lighting never changed. There was no way to tell day from night. Time became a thick, shapeless thing that pressed down on everyone like a weight. People reacted differently. Some sat against the walls and stared at nothing. Some whispered to each other in small groups, speaking about families they might never see again. A few pounded on the door until the guards activated their collars from outside, and they dropped to the floor, twitching and gasping. After the third time, no one pounded on the door anymore. Lena watched all of this. She sat in her corner, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. She said nothing for the first 12 hours. She simply observed. She watched the guards through the narrow slit in the door when they passed. She counted the intervals between patrols. She listened to the hum of the engines through the floor and the walls, building a map of the ship inside her head, layer by layer, like a blueprint drawn in sound. On the second day, she began to move. It started small. She sat next to a woman who was crying and said nothing, just sat there, shoulder to shoulder, until the woman's breathing slowed. She gave her water ration to an old man whose hands shook too badly to hold his own cup. She helped a young mother calm her infant by showing her how to wrap the child in the gray uniform fabric to keep it warm. No one noticed anything unusual. She was just a kind woman, a quiet woman, a woman who cared. But Lena was doing something else entirely. Every person she spoke to, she assessed. Every conversation was an interview conducted so gently that no one realized they were being questioned. Within 2 days, she knew the name, background, and useful skills of every person in the cell. She knew that the man in the far corner, Dov, had been a structural engineer before he retired to farm. She knew that the quiet woman near the door, Priya, had served 4 years in the Terran Union Merchant Marine. She knew that the broad-shouldered man who kept clenching and unclenching his fists, Kalia, had been a combat Marine for 15 years before his discharge. She filed each name away. She did not tell anyone what she was doing, not yet. On the 3rd day, she met Mara. Mara was 16 years old, thin and pale, with dark hair cut short and eyes that were red from crying. She had been separated from her mother during the sorting and had no idea which part of the ship her mother was in, or if she was even alive. She sat alone, arms wrapped around her knees, rocking slightly. Lena sat down beside her. "What is your name?" she asked. Her voice was calm, almost warm. "Mara," the girl did not look up. "I am Lena, are you hurt?" Mara shook her head. Then she said in a voice so small it almost disappeared, "They took my mom." "I know. Is she dead?" "No," Lena said, not with hope, with certainty, as if she had checked. "The Vreth separate captives by physical ability. Your mother is most likely in a labor hold on the lower decks. She is alive and she is waiting for you." Mara looked up. There was something in Lena's eyes that the girl could not name. Not kindness exactly, something harder than kindness. Something that burned steady and low, like a coal that refused to go out. "How do you know that?" Mara asked. Lena almost smiled. "Because I pay attention." From that moment, Mara stayed close to Lena. She did not understand why, but she felt safer near this woman. It was like standing next to a wall in a storm. The wind still howled, but something solid was between you and the worst of it. On the 4th day, the Vreth came for a discipline session. The door opened and 4 guards entered. They dragged a man to the center of the room. His name was Tomas. He had tried to hide a piece of metal he had pried from the wall, thinking he could use it as a weapon. The guards had found it during a sweep. They beat him with their lower arms while holding him upright with their upper arms, so he could not fall down and escape the blows. The sound was terrible. The other captives pressed back against the walls, some covering their ears, some unable to look away. Mara buried her face in Lena's shoulder. Lena did not look away. She watched every second of it. Her face showed nothing. Her eyes were steady and unblinking, and they moved with each strike, tracking the guards' movements the way a scientist tracks an experiment. When it was over and Tomas lay on the floor, barely conscious, one of the guards looked directly at Lena. It was the officer with gold markings, the one who had paused in front of her during the sorting. Sub-Commander Tyrek. His compound eyes locked onto her face, and for a long moment they stared at each other. He had expected to see fear. Every other human in the room was trembling or crying or looking at the floor. This one was looking at him the way he looked at his own soldiers during an inspection, measuring, calculating. It disturbed him in a way he could not explain. 2 hours later, the door opened again. A single guard pointed at Lena and gestured for her to follow. Mara grabbed her arm. "Where are they taking you?" "Somewhere quieter, I think," Lena said. She gently removed Mara's hand and squeezed it once. "I will come back for you. Do you believe me?" Mara did not know why she nodded, but she did. They led Lena down a long corridor and locked her in a small isolation cell. It was 3 meters by 3 meters, with a single light panel in the ceiling, a metal shelf that served as a bed, and a nutrient dispensing unit built into the wall. The door was solid, sealed with an electromagnetic lock. Tyrek stood outside the cell, looking at her through the narrow observation slit. She stood in the center of the room, hands at her sides, and looked back at him. "You are not afraid," he said. The translator made his clicking voice sound flat and mechanical. "Should I be?" she replied. "Every other human on this ship is afraid." "I am not every other human." He studied her for a long time. Then he turned and walked away. He entered a note in the ship's log, subject 71138, unusual psychological profile. Recommend continued observation. Threat level remains negligible. It was the last mistake he would ever make. Alone in the cell, Lena stood still for 60 seconds, listening. She listened to the footsteps retreating down the corridor. She listened to the hum of the lock. She listened to the vibration of the deck plates beneath her feet and the distant throb of the engines 3 decks below. Then she moved. She ran her fingers along every surface of the cell, feeling the seams, the joints, the tiny imperfections in the metal. She pressed her ear to the wall and listened to the sounds traveling through the ship's structure. She lay flat on the floor and felt the rhythm of the engine core, translating vibration into information. When she was finished, she stood up and spoke quietly to the empty room. 16 guards on this deck, rotating in pairs on a 4-hour cycle. Armory is 2 decks down, 40 meters toward the stern. Engine room is 3 decks below centerline. The drive core is a Class 4 Vreth Cascade reactor, crew complement approximately 800. The ship has 6 holding areas, 4 currently occupied. She paused, she looked at her hands, they were steady. "Manageable," she said. And she began to take apart the light panel. She worked in the dark. The light panel came apart in her hands like a puzzle she had solved 1,000 times before. She removed the thin power cell, the conductive strips, and the microfilament wiring with her fingers, feeling each piece by touch alone. The Vreth built their technology with efficiency, not security. They never imagined a prisoner would understand their engineering well enough to rebuild it into something dangerous. They had never met anyone like Lena Vasic. She pulled the pain compliance collar from her neck next. This should have been impossible. The collars were designed to deliver a lethal shock if tampered with, but Lena had spent the last 4 days analyzing the signal pattern through the vibrations it sent into her skin every time it pulsed. She knew the frequency. She knew the timing. And in the gap between pulses, a gap of exactly 1.3 seconds, she disconnected the trigger circuit and slid the collar off like a bracelet. She set it on the floor beside the other pieces and began to build. What she built was not a weapon, not exactly. It was a focused electromagnetic pulse device, small enough to fit in her palm, powerful enough to short out an electromagnetic door lock from a distance of 2 meters. It would work once. Once was enough. While her hands worked, her mind went somewhere else, somewhere she did not like to go. She had been 21 when they chose her, a doctoral student at the Terran University of Geneva, studying alien biology, top of her class but otherwise unremarkable. The recruiters had come in plain clothes, shown credentials she could not verify, and asked her questions that seemed strange at the time. How well did she handle pain? Had she ever been in a situation where she thought she would die? How quickly could she memorize a sequence of numbers? What was the longest she had gone without sleep? She answered honestly. She should have lied. The Prometheus enhancement program was not something that happened to your body. It was something that happened to everything you were. Over 18 months, they rebuilt her nervous system from the inside out, not with machines or genetic modification. With chemistry, conditioning, and a process they called neural restructuring that she still could not fully describe, even to herself. They pushed her brain to its absolute limits and then taught it to live there permanently. When it was over, she could read a room the way most people read a sentence. She could feel changes in air pressure on her skin. She could slow her own heartbeat to 40 beats per minute or accelerate it to 180 in seconds. She could fight, not like a soldier, but like a system designed to end fights as quickly and efficiently as possible. She could memorize a technical manual in a single reading and recall any page of it years later. There had been 90 candidates in her group. 12 survived the process with their minds intact. She was one of them. They called them Lazarus operatives, not because they came back from the dead, but because they were buried in plain sight, hidden in ordinary lives across the galaxy, waiting for exactly this kind of moment. Lena finished the device and held it in her hand. It was ugly, a tangle of wire and metal no bigger than a fist, but it would open a door, and that was all she needed. She waited for the guard rotation to pass. She counted the footsteps. 2 guards moving together, their heavy feet striking the deck plates in a rhythm she knew as well as her own heartbeat. They passed her cell. They moved on. She had 4 minutes before the next pair. She pressed the device against the door and activated it. There was a soft pop, a smell of burned metal, and the lock disengaged. The door slid open 10 centimeters. She pushed it the rest of the way with her shoulder and stepped into the corridor. It was dark. The Vreth kept their corridors dim, relying on their compound eyes which saw well in low light. But Lena had spent 4 days in darkness, and her eyes had adjusted far beyond what the Vreth would have expected from a human. She could see the corridor walls, the junction ahead, the faint glow of a directional marker on the ceiling. She moved without sound. She went down first. 2 decks, using maintenance ladders built into the walls between sections. The armory was exactly where her vibration mapping had predicted. A small room behind a sealed door, guarded by a single Vreth soldier sitting on a stool, half asleep. She came up behind it. The Vreth had powerful exoskeletons, 4 arms and reflexes that were faster than most species in the galaxy. But the soldier was relaxed, bored, and completely unprepared for the small human hand that found the nerve cluster at the base of its skull and pressed with exactly the right amount of force. The Vreth went rigid, then limp. It would wake up in approximately 2 hours with a terrible headache and no memory of the last 30 seconds. Lena opened the armory door and looked inside. Shock lances, plasma pistols, restraint devices, and a rack of what appeared to be Vreth combat blades. She took 2 plasma pistols, checked their charge levels, and tucked them into her waistband. She took a combat blade and strapped it to her forearm. Then she sealed the armory, dragged the unconscious guard inside, and moved on. She went to the main holding cell first. She had promised Mara she would come back, and Lena Vasic did not break promises. The cell door opened with a manual override she found in a junction box nearby. 50 faces stared at her from the blue darkness inside. She stood in the doorway, a plasma pistol in each hand, the collar gone from her neck, and for a moment nobody moved. Kalia was the first to stand. The old Marine looked at her, looked at the guns, looked at the empty corridor behind her and said, "How?" "Later," Lena said. "Right now I need everyone who has military or security experience to step forward. Everyone else, stay here, stay quiet, and do not open this door for anyone except me." 7 people stepped forward. Kalia, Priya from the Merchant Marine, a former police officer named Des, and 4 others whose files she had built in her head over the past days. She handed weapons to Kalia and Priya. The others would get armed from a secondary weapons locker she had identified 2 decks below. Kalia held the plasma pistol like a man reuniting with an old friend. He looked at Lena with an expression that mixed respect, confusion, and something close to fear. "What are you?" he asked. Lena met his eyes. "I am motivated," she said, "and I need your help. This ship has a crew of 800. I cannot take it alone, but I can cripple it, and I need people I trust to hold what I take. Can you do that?" Kalia stared at her for a long moment, then he nodded. "Good," she turned to the group. "We are going to take this ship, not with force, with precision. I have mapped the internal layout, the guard rotations, and the critical systems. We will disable their communications first, then their internal sensors, then isolate their crew into sections they cannot escape from. We will do this quietly. Speed matters. Surprise matters more." She looked at each of them in turn. These were not soldiers, not really. They were farmers and engineers and merchants who had once worn uniforms, but they were standing up. That was enough. Myra pushed through the group and grabbed Lena's arm. "I want to help." "You will," Lena said. "I have a job for you, a very important one, but not yet." She turned to the corridor. The ship hummed around her, vast and dark and full of enemies. Somewhere above them, Sub-Commander Tyrek was making his rounds, confident in his authority, certain in the security of his vessel, utterly unaware that the negligible woman from the observation cell was now standing in his ship with a gun in her hand and a plan in her head. Lena took a breath and stepped into the darkness. The hunt had begun. The lights on Deck 9 went out at exactly the 3rd hour of the Vreth-night cycle. No warning, no flicker, just darkness, sudden and total, swallowing the corridor like a mouth closing. The 2 guards stationed at Junction 9 Alpha stopped walking. They clicked at each other in confusion. One raised its communicator to report the outage. Static. It tried again. Nothing. The communication system on Deck 9 was dead. 40 seconds later, so were the lights on Deck 7. Lena moved through the ship like water through cracks. She had divided her small team into 3 groups. Kalia and 2 others held the main holding cell and guarded the freed captives. Priya and Des moved through the lower decks, opening the other holding cells one by one, freeing the remaining prisoners and guiding them to a secure cargo bay that Lena had identified as defensible. Lena herself moved alone through the upper decks, and she moved fast. She had memorized the ship's internal systems during her days in the isolation cell. Now she used that knowledge like a blade. She found junction boxes and rerouted power. She opened ventilation panels and crawled through spaces the Vreth considered too small for anyone to use. She reached critical relay points and disconnected them with the Vreth combat blade, cutting fiber optic bundles and shorting circuit boards with the precision of a surgeon. Deck by deck, the ship went blind and mute. Sub-Commander Tyrek knew something was wrong when his personal communicator died. He was in the officer's mess, eating his evening ration, when the device on his wrist simply stopped working. He tapped it twice. Nothing. He stood up and looked around the room. 3 other officers were doing the same thing, staring at their dead communicators with the same expression of dull confusion. Then the lights went out. In the darkness, Tyrek's instinct screamed at him. He activated his personal sidearm and moved toward the door. In the corridor outside, emergency lighting had kicked in, casting everything in a deep red glow. He could hear shouting from somewhere below, muffled and distant, and the sound of running feet. He grabbed a passing soldier. "Report." The soldier was shaking. "Communications are down on all decks, Sub-Commander. Internal sensors are offline. We have lost contact with the holding cells." Tyrek felt something cold settle in his chest. He thought of the human woman in the isolation cell, the one who was not afraid. He had marked her as negligible. He had put it in the official log. "Get me to the bridge," he said. But the bridge was 3 decks above him, and between him and the bridge, Lena Vasic had sealed every blast door on the route. She had divided the ship into sections, like cutting a snake into pieces. Each section was isolated from the others. Crew members could not reach their commanders. Soldiers could not reach the armory. Engineers could not reach the engine room. The Vreth carrier, a vessel crewed by 800 warriors, had been turned into a maze of locked boxes, and the people inside those boxes were beginning to panic. Meanwhile, Lena reached the secondary weapons locker on Deck 5. She armed the rest of her team with plasma pistols and shock lances and sent them to hold key positions. The engineering access corridor, the life support control room, and the 2 main stairwells that connected the upper and lower decks. Then she called Mara. The girl was waiting in the cargo bay with the other freed captives. When Lena appeared in the doorway, Mara ran to her. Her face was pale, but her eyes were steady. "I need you to do something for me," Lena said. She knelt so she was at the girl's eye level. "The bridge has an auxiliary power junction behind the main command wall. It feeds the weapons systems and the external communication array. I need it disconnected. The junction is inside a maintenance shaft that runs behind the bridge wall. The shaft opening is on Deck 2, Section 4. It is very narrow. Mara understood immediately. Too narrow for you. Too narrow for any adult, but not for you. Lena held out a small tool, a circuit cutter she had taken from the armory. Follow the shaft until you reach a panel with blue markings. Cut every cable behind that panel. Every one. Can you do this? Mara looked at the tool. Her hand trembled when she took it, but she took it. I am scared, she said. I know, Lena said. Being brave does not mean you are not scared. It means you do what must be done anyway. I would not ask you if there were another way. Mara nodded. She turned and ran toward the access ladder that led to Deck 2. Lena watched her go and felt something tighten in her chest. She pushed it down. There was no room for feeling right now. There was only the mission. 20 minutes later, the bridge of the Pale Dominance lost auxiliary power. The weapons systems went dead. The external communications array went silent. Overmind Sethal, the ship's commander, a massive Vreth with a scarred exoskeleton and mandibles the size of a human forearm, stood in his darkened command center, and for the first time in his long career, felt something he did not recognize. It took him several seconds to realize it was fear. Lena came for the bridge last. She came up through the ventilation system, dropping into the corridor outside the command center like a shadow falling from the ceiling. There were 6 guards at the bridge entrance, the Overmind's personal detail, the best soldiers on the ship. They saw her coming. They raised their weapons. What happened next lasted 9 seconds. Lena moved between them like something from a nightmare they had never imagined. She was smaller, lighter, and weaker than every one of them. It did not matter. She did not fight them the way they expected to be fought. She did not meet force with force. She found the gaps in their armor, the joints in their exoskeletons, the nerve clusters that their own species considered hidden. She struck with her hands, her elbows, her knees, and the combat blade, and every strike landed exactly where it needed to land. Kalia had followed her to the upper decks. He arrived at the bridge corridor in time to see the last guard fall. 6 Vreth warriors, each one twice her size, lay on the floor. Some were unconscious. Some were alive but unable to move, their limbs locked in pain. Lena stood among them, breathing hard, a thin line of blue Vreth blood on her forearm where a claw had caught her. Kalia had seen combat. He had fought in 2 border conflicts and a pirate suppression campaign. He had seen what trained killers could do, but he had never seen anything like this. She had not fought like a soldier. She had fought like someone who understood the Vreth body better than the Vreth did, who saw every movement before it happened, who treated the fight not as a battle, but as a problem to be solved with maximum efficiency and minimum time. He looked at her and felt awe, and under the awe, a thin, cold thread of something that might have been pity. Lena kicked open the bridge door. Overmind Sethal stood behind his command chair, a plasma cannon in his upper arms. He was enormous, even for a Vreth, and his compound eyes blazed with fury. Around him, his bridge crew had armed themselves with whatever they could find. 7 Vreth against 1 human. Sethal fired first. The plasma bolt hit the wall where Lena had been standing a half-second before. She was already moving, low and fast, under the arc of fire, closing the distance. He swung the cannon down. She went left. He corrected. She was already behind him. 11 seconds. That was how long it took. She disarmed him, broke 2 of his 4 arms at the joint, and put him on the ground with a strike to the back of his skull that would have killed a human, but merely stunned the thick-boned Vreth. The bridge crew surrendered when they saw their Overmind fall. Lena stood over Sethal and looked down at him. He was conscious, staring up at her with an expression she recognized. She had seen it on the faces of the colonists in the holding cell. It was the expression of someone who realized that the universe was not what they thought it was. She activated the ship's external communication array using the manual backup system on the bridge console. She had left this system intact on purpose. She wanted to talk. Her voice went out across the void, reaching every Vreth ship in the raiding fleet. "This is Dr. Lena Vasic of the Terran Union. I have taken your flagship. Your Overmind is alive and will be returned with your surviving crew in exchange for the immediate release of all human captives across your fleet. You have 1 solar cycle to comply." She paused. The silence on the channel was vast. "I will not ask twice." For a long time there was nothing. Then one by one the Vreth ships began transmitting surrender codes, small lights appearing on the bridge console like stars coming out after a storm. 1, 3, 5, all 6. Kalia leaned against the doorframe and let out a breath he felt like he had been holding for days. On the floor, Overmind Sethal stared at the ceiling and said nothing. There was nothing left to say. The cargo bay was quiet for the first time in days, not the dead silence of the holding cells, heavy with fear and despair. This was a different kind of quiet, the quiet of people sitting together who had just survived something they did not think they would survive, the quiet of breathing without terror. The freed captives filled the bay, sitting on crates, leaning against walls, lying on the floor with their eyes closed. Some slept for the first time since the taking. Some held each other without speaking. A man sat in the corner, holding a cup of water in both hands, staring at it like he had forgotten what water was. Mara found her mother in the second group of captives released from the labor holds. Her mother's hands were raw and blistered from the work the Vreth had forced her to do, and her face was thin, and she had a bruise across her left cheek that was turning yellow at the edges. But she was alive. She was alive, and she was holding Mara so tightly that the girl could feel her mother's heartbeat against her own chest, fast and fierce, and neither of them could speak because words were not big enough for what they felt. Kalia sat against a bulkhead with his legs stretched out in front of him and cried. He cried quietly, the way old soldiers cry, with his jaw tight and his shoulders still and the tears running down his face without making a sound. No one looked at him. Everyone understood. The Vreth crew had been confined to 3 sealed sections of the ship under guard. They were given food and water. Lena had insisted on this. "They are prisoners," she told Priya, who had argued against feeding them. "Not cattle. We do not become what they are." Priya had not liked it, but she had obeyed. There was something about Lena that made people obey, not because she demanded it, but because when she spoke, you believed she was right. The Terran Union battle group arrived 18 hours later. 3 heavy cruisers and a carrier, dropping out of faster-than-light transit in a flash of distorted light that was visible from the bridge viewports. They had been close, too close for coincidence. They had known where the Vreth fleet was. They had been tracking it, or tracking something aboard it, for days. The lead cruiser was the TUS Resolute, and its commanding officer was Rear Admiral Chen. He docked a shuttle in the Pale Dominance's main bay and walked aboard with an escort of Terran Marines in full combat armor. He found Lena on the bridge, standing at the main viewport, looking out at the stars. He saluted her, crisp, formal, by the book. She did not salute back. 217 civilians were taken from Avris 7, she said without turning around. "I am returning 209. 8 did not make it. 3 died during the initial raid. 2 died from injuries in the holding cells. 3 were killed when the Vreth attempted to retake Deck 4 during the operation." She turned to face him. Her eyes were level and hard. "I want their names in the report, not numbers. Names." Chen nodded. "They will be. And the colonists go home first. Before debriefing, before anything, they go home." "Agreed." Lena looked at him for a moment longer, as if weighing whether she believed him. Then she nodded once and walked past him, off the bridge, down the corridor, and away from the command that she had held for the last 6 hours. She did not look back at the stars or the Vreth ship or any of it. She was done. The news traveled fast, not through official channels at first, but through the whispered networks that connected every species in the Conquered. A Vreth raiding fleet had been captured, not by a Terran battle group, not by a fleet action or a planetary defense grid, by one woman, a single human taken as a slave, who had dismantled a warship from the inside using nothing but her hands and her mind. The conquered species reacted the way powerful beings react when they learn that something they dismissed is more dangerous than they imagined. They were quiet, they were thoughtful, and beneath the thoughtfulness they were afraid. The Rithani, a tall and ancient species who had sat on the conquered council for 10,000 years, called an emergency diplomatic session. Their ambassador, a being named Tessel who had lived for 6 centuries and had seen civilizations rise and fall, addressed the council. "We have treated the humans as children," she said. "Young, soft, clever in small ways but fundamentally harmless. We were wrong. What happened on the Vreth carrier was not an accident. It was not luck. The Terran Union's response was immediate and coordinated. They had tracking. They had protocol. They knew what this woman was capable of, and they let events unfold according to a plan that was already in place." She paused. The council chamber was very quiet. "The question we must ask ourselves is simple. If one human, placed alone and unarmed on an enemy warship, can do this, then what else have they built that we do not know about? How many of these individuals exist? And what happens if they are ever turned against us?" No one answered. The silence in that chamber said more than any words could. Subcommander Tyrek was held for debriefing by conquered intelligence. He sat in a clean white room on a conquered station, his exoskeleton still bearing the marks of the battle, his compound eyes dull and unfocused. The intelligence officer across from him, a Rithani named Voss, asked him to describe what had happened. Tyrek was quiet for a long time, then he spoke. "She was classified as negligible, academic caste. No military record, no enhancements on file, no history of violence. She weighed perhaps 60 kilograms. I could have broken her with one hand." He stopped. His mandibles clicked once, a Vreth expression of deep unease. "She took apart my ship the way I would take apart a piece of food, calmly, methodically, without anger. She knew the layout of the vessel better than my own engineers. She knew the weaknesses of our bodies better than our own doctors. She was not fighting us. She was solving us. Like we were a problem written on a board and she already knew the answer." Voss leaned forward. "Do you believe there are others like her?" Tyrek looked at him. "That is what keeps me awake," he said. "Not that she exists, but that the humans hid her in a field studying dirt and no one knew. If they can hide one, they can hide 100, 1,000. You would never know. You would never see them coming. They would be the quiet woman in the corner, the farmer, the teacher, the one you ignore." He leaned back. His voice was hollow. "We thought we were taking livestock. We were swallowing a grenade, and we did not even feel our teeth close around it." On the TUS Resolute, in a small private cabin reserved for personnel who did not officially exist, Lena sat on the edge of a narrow bed and looked at her hands. There was a bandage on her forearm where the Vreth claw had cut her. It was the only visible mark from the entire operation. Everything else she had done without taking a scratch. Her hands were steady. They were always steady. That was part of what they had done to her, part of the Prometheus process. Her body did not betray her with trembling or shaking or any of the small involuntary signals that normal humans gave off when they were afraid or exhausted or heartbroken. But she was all of those things. She picked up a small data pad from the bed beside her. On its screen was a photograph of her research station on Avris 7, the low building with its dusty windows, the sample trays lined up on the bench outside, the small garden she had planted beside the door where alien flowers grew in soil she had studied for 2 years. A quiet place, her quiet place. She stared at the photograph for a long time. Then she closed the screen and set the pad down. She knew what would happen next. A new identity, a new posting, Another quiet colony on another quiet world where she would live another ordinary life and wait for the next time the galaxy reminded humanity that it was full of teeth. She would study something small and harmless. She would make friends carefully and keep them at arm's length. She would build another garden, knowing that one day she would have to leave it behind. That was the price. That was always the price. The galaxy needed people like her to be invisible, to be everywhere and nowhere, to be the weapon no one could see. And to do that, she could never be the person she wanted to be. She could never just be a woman who studied dirt on a quiet planet and watched the sun set over golden fields. She lay back on the bed and closed her eyes. The ship hummed around her, carrying her away from Avris 7, away from the pale dominance, away from everything that had happened. Somewhere behind her, Mara was sleeping next to her mother. Kalia was sitting in the mess hall, drinking coffee and staring at the wall with the look of a man who was slowly remembering how to be alive. The colonists were safe. The Vreth were broken. The mission was complete. Lena breathed, in, out, slow and even like she had been trained. And somewhere, in the offices and council chambers and intelligence rooms of 100 different species spread across 1,000 different worlds, the galaxy looked at humanity and saw something it had never seen before. Not the small, soft, young species that grew food on frontier worlds and studied microbes in the dirt. Something else. Something that had been there all along, hidden in plain sight, quiet and patient and waiting. The galaxy looked at humanity, and for the first time it wondered, what else are they hiding? And it did not sleep well that night.